As human beings, our voices respond automatically when we want to express ourselves. We have an emotion, an idea, or a need, an impulse to communicate. And a complex signal goes through our brains and into our muscles to create vocal sounds. Another impulse generates more signals to those same muscles, which adjust to create many different vocal sounds. These muscles of the voice adjust out of our awareness, indirectly through our impulses to communicate. In singing, we want to train those muscles, a task that must be guided indirectly, especially through clear concepts of desired vocal sounds. And one of those clear concepts is understanding how vocal sounds are created. Our vocal sounds are created in the larynx, a highly complex part of our bodies as small as a walnut, located in the neck. It sits in the middle of the air passageway between the throat and the trachea, which extends down to the lungs. This tiny part of our bodies acts like a valve, opening and closing the air passageway. In its normal state, it is open and allows air to pass easily in and out of the lungs. In singing, however, it closes, and as the air forces its way out, it chops the outgoing airstream into tiny puffs of air. These tiny puffs of air are the source of our vocal sounds. Looking down the windpipe, down inside this complex larynx, we can see a clearer picture of how this valve closes and opens, and how the vocal folds in the middle come together and vibrate when air blows through, just like blowing air through a pair of closed lips, and separate to allow air back in. The vibration of our vocal folds, the rapid chopping of the airstream, is the heart of our vocal sounds. Throughout this film, we will look at why the vocal folds vibrate and why they can vibrate in different speeds and patterns, giving life to thousands of different sounds. We will see how intricate the larynx is, how its complex parts all work together like a finely crafted watch. But first, let's see why the vocal folds vibrate at all. The vocal folds vibrate because of three factors: muscles and their contraction, elasticity of the tissues, and air pressure, especially a principle called the Bernoulli Effect. Let's first examine the Bernoulli Effect, which was discovered by a scientist named Bernoulli. Bernoulli studied air pressure and noticed that when air flows through a tube, such as the one shown here, the air pressure is constant as the air passes through. But when the tube has a narrow space in the middle, the air flows faster through the narrow space, which causes the air pressure to drop in the narrow space, creating a suction there. The effect of air passing through the narrow space, the suction, is called the Bernoulli Effect. We can see that the tube resembles the air passageway, where inside the narrow space is between the vocal folds. Let's take a close look at the narrow space between the vocal folds and see in slow motion how the Bernoulli effect affects vocal fold vibration. At the very beginning of singing, the brain signals two actions: the muscles to move the vocal folds together and the breath to flow. The breath speeds up through the narrow space, creating a suction there, helping the muscles shut the folds gracefully together. At this point, we no longer have an open tube, and the first cycle of vibration has begun. Then air pressure builds up beneath the folds until it bursts through, creating a tube with a narrow space in the middle, where the Bernoulli effect sucks the vocal folds together and a puff of air escapes. Another cycle begins. Air pressure builds up, until it bursts through, creating a tube with a narrow space in the middle. And because of the fold's elasticity, the folds are sucked back together and another puff escapes. The cycle then repeats itself again and again, much faster than shown here, so fast that the vocal folds vibrate 261 times a second for middle C, over 1,000 times a second for high C. We have seen how the vocal folds vibrate, how they chop the airstream into puffs of air, the source of vocal sounds. But before describing how the vocal folds can adjust the way they vibrate, and how they can influence the singing tone, let us introduce the cast of characters for this film. First, we have the cartilages of the larynx, important supporting characters of the film, and the intrinsic muscles, located in and around the cartilages, more supporting characters. And finally, the vocal folds, the major intrinsic muscles which are the leading characters of the film. We begin this story by examining the cartilages, which form the framework, the support of the larynx. These cartilages are the cricoid, the thyroid, and the pair of arytenoids. From the front view, we can see that this framework of cartilage sits on top of the trachea and is suspended from the hyoid bone by interconnecting ligaments and membranes. To keep you oriented, the hyoid bone is at the base of the tongue. Let's take a close look at each of these cartilages. The lowest cartilage is the cricoid. It is circular, and from the side, we can see that the back part of the cricoid is larger than the front, like a signet ring. The cricoid forms a foundation for the other parts of the larynx. The next character of our film, the thyroid, is located above the cricoid. It is the largest cartilage of the larynx and has been traditionally compared to the shape of a shield. From the side view, we can see that the front of the thyroid is solid and has a protruding notch called the Adam's apple that is more prominent in men than in women. And in back, the thyroid cartilage is open, with 4 extensions called horns. The 2 top horns, called the superior horns, are attached to the hyoid bone with ligaments. The 2 bottom horns, called the inferior horns, are attached to the outer walls of the cricoid in a synovial joint, an amazing joint that permits more flexible movement than can be found in other joints. Because the thyroid and cricoid are attached with a synovial joint, the thyroid can rock up and down and can also slide forward and back, movements that will have a major effect on vocal sounds, as you will soon see. Another supporting character of our film, a pair of arytenoid cartilages, sits on the back of the cricoid. The shape of each arytenoid has 3 pointed tips: the muscular process in back, the apex at the top, and the vocal process in front. Looking once more at the arytenoids from a top view, you can see the same 3 points: the muscular process in back, the apex at the top, and the vocal process in front. The arytenoids, like the thyroid, are attached with a synovial joint that permits them to slide from side to side and also to pivot. Throughout this film, you will also see the epiglottis, a cartilage that looks like a large leaf suspended over the larynx. The epiglottis moves downward when we swallow to help prevent food or liquid from entering the trachea and lungs. And although it's a cartilage of the larynx, the epiglottis does not directly affect vocal fold vibration and is not listed as a supporting character of this film. Up to this point, we have centered our attention on 3 cartilages of the larynx. Now, let's look at the intrinsic muscles. The intrinsic muscles are called intrinsic because they are the family of muscles that are inside the larynx. First, they are the cricothyroids. Notice that the name cricothyroid comes from the 2 cartilages that the muscles attach to, the cricoid and the thyroid. Then we have the cricoarytenoids, which extend from the cricoid to the arytenoids in back, called the posterior cricoarytenoids, and also on the sides, called the lateral cricoarytenoids. Then we have the interarytenoids, which are between the 2 arytenoid cartilages. Finally, there's the thyroarytenoid muscle, which has 2 parts, a large external part and an internal part, both of which extend from the thyroid to the arytenoids. The internal part, with its special edges, make up the focus of our film, the vocal folds. As we study the intrinsic muscle, what really interests us is what happens right at the edges. Here, each movement of the edges kicks the air molecules around them, setting up a pattern that ultimately ripples through the air to someone's ear. If the edges had only one shape, one thickness, one length, and one constant level of tension, these muscles would be simple to explain. But the intrinsic muscles can transform these edges into many shapes, thicknesses, and lengths, and each will send a different pattern rippling through the air. Let's take a closer look at the vocal folds. If we slice the larynx, we can see inside and see why the vocal folds can transform their edges into so many different configurations. The vocal folds, seen here sliced in half, are made up of several layers. The first layer is made up of muscle, the internal thyroarytenoid muscle, as we've already seen. This muscle is also named the vocalis muscle. The vocalis is a complex muscle. Its muscle fibers weave through in various directions, which means the vocalis can contract in various ways. The next layer is a ligament, called the vocal ligament. It forms a tough protective edge for the vocalis muscle.